Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. The headline is War in Europe, perhaps a headline that our parents and grandparents have seen, but certainly not something that we have been seeing. We're going to be talking about the Russian attack on Ukraine, what it all means, how the West is responding, and what world we are entering into. And here with us are three people who are following the story as closely as possible. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Karen DeYoung, Associate National Editor of the Washington Post and Senior National Security Correspondent. Hi, Karen. Great to have you.
Hi.
And from London, Gideon Rachman, who is the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent, columnist for the Financial Times. Gideon, great to have you here as well. And from Brussels, Steve Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for the New York Times. Thank you all for joining today. It is a bleak week, and we're entering a bleak period here. You've all been on the front lines reporting the story. It's almost too difficult for even full-time journalists to figure out what's going on. But let's try to break it all down. And Karen, let me start with you. Sort of help us, bring us up to date about where we are from the moment that it became pretty clear that an attack was coming to where we are today.
Well, I think I've got my cheat sheet here because things are happening so quickly that anything you say now is overwhelmed by events. In the next 10 minutes. But of course, we saw the Russian troops begin to mobilize. We saw attacks in the area of the Donbass, the place that's been occupied and a front line between Ukraine forces and Russian-backed separatists now for a number of years. That was then followed by apparent missile strikes in Kharkiv, which is very close to the border with Belarus. And now you've seen in the past, even the past 24 hours, if you look at the maps that we at the Post and other people are posting with little red dots for apparent strikes all over the country. There have been air raids in Lviv, which is in the very far west, close to the Polish border, in the south near Odessa, in Mariupol, which is to the east of Crimea. You've seen troops now getting reportedly very close to Kyiv. Reports of President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has said that there are saboteurs in the city, that he is their target. His family's gone into hiding. He gave a very, in the wee hours of this morning, a very sort of sad video saying, why isn't anyone coming to help us? Although he knows full well why no one's coming to help him, because NATO is defending NATO. The question is, how do you get it to stop at this point? And there doesn't seem to be any real answer to that. The Russians this morning answered Zelensky's plea to have some talks by saying, you're not even a real government, you're a puppet government, we're not going to talk to you. And out of the Kremlin remarks that, we'll talk to you when there is demilitarization and denazization, which is basically means get rid of all your weapons, get rid of the puppets in Kyiv, which Putin has described as Nazis. And that goes way back to World War II and Western Ukraine, and who fought with the Germans and who fought with the Russians when the front lines were in Ukraine. The Russian Foreign Ministry again this morning demanded long-term legally binding security guarantees from NATO, ensuring that Ukraine will not join NATO, and that the frontline states on the eastern flank of NATO, that U.S. troops and other troops and weaponry will be withdrawn from the countries along Russia's border. And of course, NATO and the United States have said very strongly that they are not going to do that. Countries are drawing up sides. China's been sitting on the fence, going back and forth. We can talk about that later. Surprisingly, you've seen a number of countries that have been sort of in the Russian camp. Venezuela put out a statement that didn't say anything about the rights of Russia to do this, but just basically called for it all to stop and for talks to begin. So there are going to be more sanctions. The EU apparently decided this morning to do sanctions personally on Putin and on Lavrov, his foreign minister. So I was just looking at a thing that it's a statement from the deputy Ukrainian defense minister, and there's really no way to verify any of this stuff. This is their accounting of losses inflicted on the invaders as of 3:00 their time this afternoon. Destruction of 80 tanks, destruction of 516 armored vehicles of various types, 10 aircraft, 7 helicopters, and 2,800 special personnel casualties on the other side. Now, I would take all of that with a grain of salt, but that's what they're claiming for the moment.
Thanks, Karen. That's a really comprehensive update on where we are. Steve, let's talk first of all about what's happening in Russia, in the sense that, of course, the government is full horse behind this war. The rhetoric that's coming out on denazification, which I think, as Karen rightly says, is really about getting a new government. Regime change is what we call that used to call, is what they're after, a fundamentally different regime. But inside Russia, it seems to be there's not complete agreement that this is the thing that people were hoping to see. And in fact, it seems to have come as a big surprise. And you wonder whether Putin had done enough to prepare his own population for what's occurring, or whether his propaganda to soothe and try to dissuade the West may have also done the same with their own people.
You're right, but I don't think it matters. I mean, he's a dictator now. I mean, he's not even the head of the Politburo. He's one guy with a couple people who decides everything. And the way he treated his National Security Council in a pre-recorded television thing, right, was excruciating. It was the kind of thing that Stalin used to do to his Politburo when he made them dance together, only they did that in private. This was put out on TV. This was like Blofeld controlling Spectre, saying, speak clearly, making fun of people. The Russian people, I think, and there are some Poles, are kind of shocked by this. They don't want to go to war with Slavic brothers. These are supposed to be their brothers, not their enemies. Some people, no doubt, I mean, there's been a torrent of state propaganda about how Ukraine is a cat's paw of NATO, and NATO's trying to destroy Russia, and NATO wants to put nuclear arms inside Ukraine and all that. But I think, Russians know how to watch their own television pretty well by now. But what is striking is there have been some demonstrations. There have been quick arrests. They've been suppressed. I just think among the Russian types that we talk to, the think tank types and the academic types and the foreign policy types, and some of the officials, there's horror, there's shock. I mean, there's a sense that one man's obsession with twisted history has driven Russia into a war that nobody really wanted, that is going to change our lives for a generation, in my view, and will do great damage to Russia's reputation, to its economy, to its future, and draw a new dividing line inside Europe, whether he takes over Ukraine or not. It is a very big moment, and I'm not sure I don't know what his real military aims are. I mean, the Russians have been lying about its military aims and its aims ever since this began. There's no reason to think they're not lying now. I mean, my guess is they will reduce Ukraine to a Western rump and seize a big chunk of it in the east, get their land bridge to Crimea, and have a sort of government put into place in Kiev that is basically doing, like in Belarus, pretty much what Moscow needs done.
Gideon, if that's the aim, and everything I think points to that, the Ukrainians has something to say, of course, about that as well. And I think we're all struck and watched Zelensky in a number of speeches really stepping up and leading his country. I think it was Italian Prime Minister Draghi who mentioned the extraordinary way in which his intervention call into the council meeting last night at the EU really shook people up in the way that he talked about it. What do you think of Zelensky and the government's immediate response, and also help us think through? Before this, Zelensky was very dismissive of the possibility of a major invasion. We talked about this before, probably because he didn't want to spook the economic foundation of his own country. But as a result, the whole thing has come as a total shock, it seems to me, to people in Ukraine itself, not just in the Donbass where one would have expected this, but in Kyiv and other places. Every Ukrainian we see seems to have been shocked. Talk a little bit about sort of how Ukraine prepared for this confrontation and what you see how it is trying to come together now in order to defend their country.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, so I was at the Munich Security Conference, which was just like a week before this happened. And
was this weekend?
Yeah, God,
last weekend, believe it or not.
Time flies, doesn't it? Yeah, 5-6 days ago. And saw Zelensky speak on Saturday. And I remember thinking, you could be dead in a week, to be honest, because I had just had terrifying briefings from the British and the Americans who've been saying for some time, and with increasing urgency, there is a plan to attack the whole of the country, Kiev, go direct to Kiev. And Zelensky was asked, isn't there a risk for you coming here? Because there was even thought that maybe the Russians would stop him flying back. And he said, I had my breakfast in Kiev and I will have my dinner in Kiev, and I expect to be there for some time. He was already, the tone had shifted a bit from the slightly insouciant, forget it, stop destabilizing the economy air of maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. He was quite angry with the West. He was saying, we're the West front line, you should be helping us. And in fact, almost the most memorable moment in Kiev was when, at least the public, forums, was when Vasily Klitschko, who's this enormous guy, a former world heavyweight boxing champion, 7'6" of muscle, who's the mayor of Kiev, stood up and said, send us defensive weapons. We're ready to fight for our families, for our fatherland. And then he looked at the German foreign minister, Baerbock, and said, thanks for the 5,000 helmets, but it's not enough. And she looked like though she wanted the ground to open up beneath her. It was a shaming moment. But on the other hand, I think, as you say, many Ukrainians didn't really believe it. I went to a dinner with a bunch of Ukrainian opinion formers, MPs, and so on. Again, it was a Saturday night, so like 4 days before it all happened. And my ears were still full of all this stuff. And I was talking to one MP. And again, he was very focused. Incidentally, super English, very sophisticated guy. He was very focused on the economic damage to Ukraine still. He was telling me, the British and the Americans have left, but, the Chinese embassy is still open and they must know something. That's probably why they're, they know there's not going to be an invasion. And I said, well, look, I've heard different. I think they're going to go for Kiev, is what I've heard. And he said, but Kiev's such a long way from the Russian frontier. And I said, from Belarus. And he looked like it was a shock to him, like it was the first time this had occurred to him. So I think they were psychologically unprepared. I mean, maybe somebody said to me, what were they going to do about it? Because they're going to be wiped out. They're fighting very bravely, but they're massively outgunned. So if you say the Russians are going to come for you full force, that's a counsel of despair. So maybe almost as a protective mechanism, people didn't want to believe it, but now it's happening.
Sure is, and they now know that it is happening and it's going all the way. Unfortunately, Steve, let's turn to the Western response. So far, we, as you sit in Brussels, a virtual meeting of the NATO heads of state is taking place. The European Union is finalizing its sanctions. President Biden announced what the U.S. is going to do, as did Prime Minister Johnson, and more countries are coming out. How do you, what has the response been? Where do you think it's fallen short? And how effective do you think it's going to be?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it's failed. If the intent was to deter Putin from doing this, it's failed. I mean, it's a failure of Western policy and choices. It didn't deter Putin. So we're watching Ukraine get eaten up by a crocodile, and we're watching, and we're not doing anything. We're wringing our hands, which is fine. And, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and I went to the Maidan, and, I just put it this way: what does being a strategic partner of NATO mean? That's one of the questions that one might raise. So the Western response, it's punishment now. It's not deterrence. The sanctions are punishment. And they're real. I mean, they are real. And the Western unity is pretty real. I mean, I don't know how long it will hold together. To really punish Russia, it will have to hold together for a year or 2 years. But these are very devastating sanctions over time to the Russian economy, to Russian industry, to the Russian elite, to the Russian banking system. This is not, tiddlywinks. Now, there are a couple other things that are still not sanctioned. One of the main things is energy. I mean, Russia gets 30% of its GDP from energy sales. And there has been no sanctioning on energy exports or imports, put it that way, out of Russia. Why? Because, even America uses Russian oil, but Europe gets 40% of its natural gas from Russia and 25% of its oil. Italy is very dependent on Russian gas. Hungary is completely dependent. Bulgaria is completely dependent. Germany is 55 to 60% of its natural gas comes from Russia. While they're trying to build up economic growth, while they're trying to do a green, economy, they need gas for a bridge. So that hasn't been touched yet, though that would be most painful for Russia. And for the same reason, they have decided not yet to throw Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. Now, that's a bit complicated. We ran a very good explanation of SWIFT and why people are reluctant. The Post has done very good things. The FT's certainly done also very good things. But we need to be able to pay Russia for the gas and for other things. And cutting them out of SWIFT would make it very difficult to actually do that. Though that's hanging. There are countries in the EU that want to throw them out of SWIFT. And President Biden made it very explicit. He said, the only reason we're not throwing them out of SWIFT because the European Union didn't want us to. So there's a key thing there. And then, there's talk about other things. Britain banned Aeroflot from flying through British airspace, which is a big deal, right? And there'll be retaliation. The Germans had banned RT, the sort of Russian-owned propaganda station, from their German language networks. So Russia's retaliated with banning Deutsche Welle. So, I mean, there are oligarchs that, you could punish, but I think it's a pretty good set of sanctions. The other question that comes is, how will Russia retaliate? What will the counter sanctions be? And how well will the European Union in particular, because they're much more affected than the Americans are, they do much more trade with Russia than the US does. How will they protect member states that are hit disproportionately by these sanctions and by counter sanctions? So it's not a bad showing for the West, but at the same time, it failed.
Karen, it failed in terms of deterring the attack, because the attack's going on. We now live with the consequences. As Steve said, punishment on the economic side. There's still a lot of deterrence and defense to be done, because we don't quite know whether Putin will stop in Kyiv, leave, or Warsaw. And so, how do you think the West has responded to, on the military side and the national security side, what NATO is discussing, as well as more generally? How do you see it?
Well, I think Steve's right in the sense that none of this is going to stop Russia from doing what it's doing at the moment. The sanctions are very tough, and they probably will get tougher, but the Russians are in a pretty good position to resist for the month or 2 or 3 that it takes for people in Russia to really say, hey, what's going on? How come I can't buy this? How come, the ruble has sunk to its lowest level ever, which apparently it has. And people start feeling that. And the Russian government starts feeling it. I think that, whether we'll get to the point that we ban Russia from SWIFT, which, as Steve said, the Germans and the Italians really don't want to do at the moment, because it's really going to hurt their own economies. How long Americans are prepared to put up with rising gas prices and other inconveniences that may result from all of this. NATO and the US, there's a lot of push in Congress that I think will find an open door with the administration to send more weaponry to Ukraine. It's going to be a little bit difficult to get it there because you can't fly it there. And, the Ukrainian defense minister posted on YouTube last night calling for more weapons and said, don't worry, you can just bring them to the Polish border. We'll take care of it. So, there will be more weapons going. But I think the sort of speed of this and the determination of the Russians mean that it's just going to happen. I think over the longer term, there will be results inside NATO. I think NATO unity is strengthened. I think that particularly when they come out with the strategic concept this summer, there's going to be a big push to have burden sharing be a little more sharing, and for the Europeans to pick up more tasks. But again, I don't think any of it's going to make any difference to what happens in the next week or so, where the Russian intention is to take over Kyiv. At least this is what everyone seems to believe, and certainly U.S. intelligence believes, to install a puppet government and kind of dare anybody to do anything about it. The Russians can strike back with cyber. They can push migrants across the border that will upset the Europeans, even though they're all being very nice about it right now and saying, welcome Ukrainians. So there are lots of things that they can do. I think that NATO does not want to get into a war, obviously, with Russia. Nobody in Europe does. And they're not going to come to Ukraine's rescue with troops or any kind of military intervention.
Gideon, I think Karen's right that the battle has lines have sort of been drawn. The Russian military is bigger than the Ukrainian military. There's very little we can do other than direct intervention, which we won't, to prevent Russia from taking over Kyiv. I think and do what it is promising to do, to have a new government there. I guess there are two big questions that come out of that. One is, once you've done that, how sustainable is that if there is in fact a guerrilla or a counter or an insurgency campaign that one would expect to emerge from Ukraine, given national sentiment, which is only being strengthened in the last 3 or 4 days by the Russian attack? And then secondly, should we be worried about Russia having bigger ambitions? I'm thinking here about, Steve wrote about this today in today's New York Times. The Belarus Kaliningrad corridor is all of 60 miles long, and now that the Belarus is basically integrated in the military structure of Russia, will there be an attempt to settle some other scores, like cutting off the Baltics from a land bridge to NATO, 3 countries that don't have a lot of defenses, by the way, also very dependent on Russian gas. As such, so how do you see those two things developing, and are we paying sufficient attention to those potentialities? On the one hand, helping the Ukrainians; on the other hand, preventing or deterring Russia from going any further in Ukraine.
Well, I think the first question, the insurgency and what to do about it, is already a live debate. In fact, it was a live debate in Munich even before this invasion happened, and I sensed a division of opinion already emerging on it. There's a gung-ho crowd, particularly well represented in the Anglosphere, UK, Australia, US, which is basically says we will have a moral and a strategic obligation to fuel the insurgency, to get weapons to the Ukrainians who are fighting back, and that this could eventually turn into sort of Putin's graveyard if we're lucky and play it right, and people cite the Russian involvement in Afghanistan and how draining that was. There's another school of thought, which is a bit stronger perhaps with the French and Germans, which is very concerned that, firstly, about the humanitarian implications of that. Are we going to turn Ukraine into the next Syria? Fuel a civil war that goes on and on and on, horrible costs. We don't actually win, but a lot of people suffer. A lot of people get turned into refugees. You have a constant instability. That's one argument. And also, are we convinced the Russians will take it lying down if we're fueling an insurgency on their, frontiers? Somebody said to me, well, what if, okay, you mentioned bringing the weapons to the frontier. What if they decide to hit that convoy of Stinger missiles that's heading towards insurgencies, that they might see that as a casus belli. So this debate is just beginning, and I think will become very real in the next few weeks. I think
Steve, do you want to jump in on that point, and then we'll come back to you, Gideon?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Gideon, why don't you go on, and then I'll.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think the most people I speak to on the sort of does Putin's ambitions, do they stretch further? Still want to believe that he wouldn't be crazy enough to attack a NATO state. That, however weak we look, that is a huge thing to test. But on the other hand, people clearly underestimated what he was prepared to do now. So we've got him wrong once, maybe we'll get him wrong again. And to the extent that this is based on his assessment of our weakness, maybe he thinks, actually, they're not even going to enforce Article 5 over the Baltic states. Nobody wants to fight a war with Russia. That's why he essentially threatened us with nuclear war the other day. And one of, fairly senior Western ex-leader said to me that he thought it was a mistake for the West to say right at the beginning, we're not going to fight in Ukraine. That was done to reassure the public. But he said, if you take that off the table, Putin, you're already sort of sending a signal of weakness. I don't know what I think about that, but that was a view. So, yeah, we got to hope that he may be crazier than we thought, but he's not so crazy as to launch World War III. I don't know what you think. You're a former ambassador to NATO. What do you reckon?
Well, on the first instance, I actually think history will do some serious look at the first decision to not to rule out U.S. and NATO troops in Ukraine to defend it. Once you had ruled that out, you in fact did give him free reign in Ukraine, and basically said you can take it, but just don't do anything more than that. That leads to a dynamic that I think we're seeing playing out now. I am worried that this can go much further, much quicker.
Much quicker as well. Not that he's going to pause.
Not that he's going to pause. In part because I think his ability to maintain Ukraine depends on scaring the bejesus out of everyone of us in order not to help the Ukrainians. And I do think he's living in a different framework right now than we see. And I'm struck that how few people believed U.S. intelligence when the U.S. intelligence was about as good as it possibly could be. And when I talk to folks in the administration, I think they are worried what may come next. So it is, and for a good reason. I think, as you said, Gideon, if he could do this, why not the next step? And if it's based on a conception of Russian strength and Western weakness, which is widely believed by Putin and by Xi, I think that's something that come about. Steve, before we go to the larger piece, do you wanted to jump in there?
Well, I did, because I've watched Russia fight in Chechnya, in Budyonov. I've watched it fight in its own world, and it's savage. The subtlety isn't the way they fight. And I think, that's one difference from Afghanistan, frankly. We don't fight in quite the same way. I mean, people say the first day of the war has gone pretty well for the Ukrainians. They've fought back. The Russians haven't taken all. They'll escalate. I mean, he's in, as I say, if he's in for a kopeck, he's in for a ruble. I mean, Putin can't lose this. Now, over time, perhaps there can be insurgencies, but look at Belarus. I mean, do you hear a peep out of Belarus? I mean, after what Lukashenko's done and the way Russia's helping and so on. I admire the Ukrainian people. They have a history of partisan fighting, all that. But this is a different world. This isn't Pashtun land. And the only other thing I'd say about NATO, there's going to be a lot of money spent on NATO. And I think, if Putin moves, he'll move more on Moldova, which is another one of these not members of NATO, very close to Ukraine. There's Transdniester, where the Russians already are, right? I mean, he's going to eat away. And I think part of what it does is it eats away at the confidence the Eastern flank has that NATO can protect them, because suddenly the strategic depth of Ukraine and Belarus are gone. And this puts it really cheek by jowl. And, it's a scary moment. I think, NATO's been living kind of on the self-confidence of the end of the Cold War and 30 years of peace. It hasn't been spending that much money on defense. It has, it's undercut its hard power. It's gone into cyber, it's done many things. You take the British Army as a good example. I mean, what are there, 140 tanks in the whole British Army now? And
70,000 people. You could get the whole British
70,000 people under arms, right? I mean,
you get the whole army into Wembley Stadium and it'd be 30,000 empty seats.
It's exactly. And it's extraordinary. And, NATO wants Britain to put tanks into Germany. And of course, Germany needs to put tanks into Poland. Right? I mean, as odd as that sounds these days, but I really think there needs to be a big step up in hard deterrence. And I think that's going to happen. And as I say, it's going to change spending and attitudes for a long time to come. I've gone on too long.
No. So I think that's a very good transition, Gideon, to, because it's the beginning of rethinking, right? I think it was Macron who said it, Merkel repeated it. This is a turning point. Mm-hmm. And when you think about a turning point to what? What does this new world look like? How do we think differently about the world that is emerging today from the world that we've seen in the last 30 years? I mean, this is clearly the end of the post-Cold War period. If you can even think about in those terms, RIP 1991, 2022, right? It's different. The idea of engagement and cooperation with Russia, or indeed engagement and cooperation with China, is being replaced with the idea of confrontation and containment, if not competition. How do you you're a big thinker. How should we think about?
I'll try and think. Yeah.
In 800 words. Yeah.
So look, I mean, I think there are two analogies that are doing the rounds right now. One is the Cold War, and that's the one we reach for most instinctively. It's the one a lot of us lived through. Okay, it's back to the Cold War, and Russia's the enemy, and we need to deter. Globalization will begin to splinter. It's already over as far as Russia's concerned, and maybe, it'll be much, much harder ask with China because they're much more deeply integrated into the global economy, but maybe that will happen too. I mean, I think another way of thinking about it, which is even more disturbing, is more like the beginnings of the Second World War, where you have, again, two big revisionist powers, one in Europe and one in Asia, both sort of angry, humiliated countries. A lot of what Russia is a bit like, Germany after the First World War, the sense that they had been humiliated, treated badly, that their ethnic brothers are on the wrong side of a border, rebuild national strength and unite around this Führer figure. It is a bit reminiscent, I'm afraid. I know we're all told correctly to be cautious about comparisons with the Second World War, but it's sort of difficult to avoid in this. And then I think that the other thing that really interests me is this connection between, Moscow watching Beijing and Beijing watching Moscow, and each possibly taking a cue from each other as they, in this joint project of challenging American power. And, in the same way that I think, from my reading of history, the way Tokyo's decision to take on America in the 40s was very influenced by what was happening in Europe. And the specter of Western weakness in Europe kind of emboldened them a bit. And obviously that's the next question. Is China emboldened by this? Some people say, the Chinese are a bit uncomfortable with what the Russians are doing, et cetera, et cetera. They may feel that the Russians have poked the Western bear, if I can call it that, a bit too soon. They're certainly bolder. But I think basically they share a common project, which is undermining the unipolar world, ending this world in which America is so dominant. That's a very powerful joint interest.
Karen.
I think you also, it's one of many dilemmas for the United States. We've gone through at least 3 administrations now saying, "Oh yes, we're pivoting to Asia. China is the main threat." What do you do now when you have to turn your attention in the other direction? Well, one of the things you do is to say to Europe, okay, it's really time now. You've avoided all this for years, but you have got to take responsibility for this. As much as the Americans have kind of demanded that over the years, it's kind of a hard nut for them to say, you're our equal. We're in this. They always say we're in this together, but the Americans like to be the leader. It's going to be very difficult for them to turn their attention in the way that they want to China, which is good for China, and to focus in one direction while the more immediate threat is in the other direction. And I think that they've, even as over the years they've said, we really have to turn our attention to China, that's been based on the assumption that Russia's just sitting there becoming weaker and weaker. And all of a sudden you can debate how weak or strong Russia is, but it's certainly aggressive. And whatever strength it has, shown that it's willing to use that strength. So I think it is a real problem. That's one aspect as you look toward the future, how that's going to plan out. And it's something that the Chinese, as much as they resist this sort of, don't turn toward us, it can only make them happy.
Yeah, I think, Steve, both Karen and Gideon sort of get on a critical point. I think one of the differences between the 1930s and, say, the 1940s, the Cold War analogy, or is this pre-World War II, is it a Cold War, is exactly what Karen points out. It's the American role. Of course, America's absent prior to World War II, and it's present after World War II. And now that's the challenge is no longer to Britain, as it was Germany in some ways in the 1930s. It's the challenge to the United States. And how does the U.S. react to that? Do we divide and say, Europe, you take care of Europe so we can take care of Asia, as Karen suggests might be one strand? Is there another way to do this? And by the way, do the Europeans and the Americans, are they ready for taking on that project? Is, I guess, the really big question.
Well, these are all very important questions. I mean,
and we only have 5 minutes to settle this.
No, it's okay. Okay. I mean, I can settle it in 3. No worries. The Americans should put in 2 heavy divisions into Poland, like right now, right? And that's a big deal. And Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who was the former German defense minister, said Ukraine shamed her, that basically the Bundeswehr is an empty shell. So, I mean, Germany's going to have to take this on board. Now, ideally, what Karen suggests should happen, and I do believe this will put an end to some of the theology about European autonomy, European sovereignty, because it is so clear that NATO needs real cooperation between the EU, which has economic competence, resilience, and disinformation skills, and NATO. NATO's not going away, and the Americans aren't going away. Now, China, we don't have time for this, but it starts to get into questions of what are the nuclear guarantees in Asia. They're very different from what they are inside Europe. And of course, in Europe too, you also have doubts about 2024. I mean, how long is Joe Biden going to live, if I can be so rude as to put that question out there? Will he run again? Will Trump run again? Will a Trump-like person come? The great hypothetical question people ask me, and I don't know the answer, what would it be like if Trump were president now with Ukraine? Would he care? I mean, he's been praising Putin on TV for 3 days now for being brilliant.
It'd be hard to get 2 divisions sent to Poland.
It'd be hard. I mean, he said Putin is, doing it for $2 worth of sanctions. That's what Trump said. So the Europeans are worried about, is this, as someone said to me, the last time the Americans come to help us?
Yeah.
Gideon?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's a very interesting counter. I mean, I'm sure the Trump people would say, in fact, Trump did say, this would never have happened if I was president. And I think it might not have, because Putin had good reason to hope that Trump would sink NATO of his own accord. I think the Europeans were very worried that he would do that in a second term. And maybe when Putin was faced with a more conventional American president who was prepared to actually increase support to Ukraine, he decided that, he would take the military option.
Appeasement is sometimes the best way to avoid war. That's certainly part of the equation. I mean, there are a lot of questions here that all of you raise. I think we will have to watch in the weeks ahead. I think that the point that people need to understand is that this is a different world. We woke up on the February 24 in a world that is very different than we went to bed on February 23rd. And I think we will look back in history and remember December 7 as we do. We remember September 11 as we do. We remember November 9 as we do when the wall came down. We will remember February 24 as the day that a very new era emerged in Europe with implications for global politics writ large, including the inevitable triangulation between China, Russia, the United States, and of course Europe as key players, even as all of the problems that we talked about before this, whether it's climate change or all the issues that are there, will remain. They didn't go away just because Vladimir Putin decided to wage war against, in an unprovoked manner, against one of its neighbors. It's been a sobering discussion, but I want to thank all of you, Karen DeYoung, Gideon Rachman, Steve Erlanger, for joining us. For those watching, continue to Watch us, download our podcast, World Review with Ivo Daalder, and read the incredible reporting that continues to come out of the pens and typewriters. You use computers, the computers of these three journalists. I certainly do. I hope all of you do too. Wish you all a very good weekend. Our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine who are finding a world that they had hoped and thought would never happen that has now come to them. With that, thank you all for watching. We'll be back again next week with another edition of World Review. Thank you.